So welcome to the Wheeler Institute COVID-19 series. Today we are pleased and honored and very happy to welcome to our series Matthias Doepke to talk about some of his very recent and topical research about the effects of COVID-19 on gender equality as it unfolds, and perhaps discuss also about the medium-term implications. Well, Matthias doesn't need much of an introduction. He has been one of the, I would say, the founders of this very exciting search of research, start of research, family economics. Before being married and before having kids, I was a bit unclear about this literature. Then I realized the deep insights. And not only that, Matthias has written some great papers, for example, about pre-industrial Europe and how it developed, some very cool papers on macroeconomics and money as a medium of exchange. So most recent of today is, and also let me just mention his ongoing work with Fabrizio Ziliboti on parenting styles and how inequality affects the way we raise our kids and what are the implications for the macroeconomy more generally. So Matthias, thanks a lot for taking the time. We understand that you are very busy, writing papers topical about the crisis, writing other very interesting papers, editing a journal. It's all very time consuming. So I know that you have been working with Michel Tertelt and various other co-authors on the gender implications of COVID-19. Can you just briefly tell us about what you find, what kind of data you use, and what are the tentative, I would say tentative, the evidence is there, but the crisis unfolds.
Yes, so thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I should add, in addition to what you've mentioned, of course, I have a ton of childcare to do. One of the characteristics of the crisis is we spend now different order of magnitude on time on childcare and homeschooling, and that is one of the aspects that matters for us, but also that is one of the reasons why gender really plays a big role in this crisis. And so Michel and I have done some work on family economics as it relates to macroeconomics. We argue that family decision making actually is quite important in many macroeconomic questions too. And recessions are a good example of this. And so what really struck us is the contrast between what we're going through right now, the COVID-19 recession. We call it sometimes the great lockdown recession, because this lockdown is really why we have this downturn. The contrast of this crisis with usual business cycles that we had previously. And the interesting observation there is that earlier business cycles are what sometimes referred to as man sessions, namely they hit a man a lot more than they do women. If you look, for example, at the financial crisis 2007 to 2009, many more men than women lost their job, so male unemployment went up by a lot more than women's unemployment. And this has to do with the fact that many men work in sectors like construction and manufacturing that go down a lot in a usual recession. And some women, many women work in safer sectors like the public sector or education. And also some women are more flexible in the labor supply. So you even have some women joining the labor force in a recession to make up for the job loss of their husband. And so you see very different behavior of male and female labor markets during typical recessions. Now, what struck us from the start is that this time it's likely to be very different for really two different but equally important reasons. And one is sector of employment. So I mentioned that men work often in construction, for example. Now, in this recession, the sectors most affected are very different from a usual recession. The largest employment losses, for example, are in restaurants and hotels and hospitality, which are all sectors which are very high in women's employment. A large fraction of the workers there are women. So that's the first reason that we see a very different impact. And the second reason is what I mentioned at the very beginning. Childcare requirements are much higher. Schools are closed, daycares are closed. In addition, grandparents, for example, are also not available because you're not really supposed to expose older people to the germs of your children at this time. So it's really down to the parents. And that often means women more than men, to some extent, because there's many more single moms than single dads, but also because among couples raising kids together, women still provide the majority of the childcare in the majority of cases. And this led us to expect that this would be a very different recessions, which has implications for what happens during the crisis, but also for what we should expect during the recovery. And so we started working on this actually a couple of months ago, at that point, mainly based on pre-crisis data. So we were just documenting the division of childcare among couples, and we were documenting who works in which sectors. For example, are there more women or men in critical sectors? are there more women or men who have jobs where you can telecommute and you can work from home during the crisis? And on that basis, we made this prediction that women will be more affected. Of course, now we're into the crisis and we can already see that these things have turned out the way we expected. So for example, in the latest US unemployment report, we see that women's unemployment has gone to more than 16%, so a historical high. Men's unemployment only to 13%. So it is a much bigger crisis for women than for men in the labor market. And it's really the opposite of what you see in a usual recession.
And I know that in your research you use data from the US, but can we expect similar patterns, I guess, in the United Kingdom, Germany, where you come from, or more generally, let's call the advanced economies, although I hate this word?
Right. So yeah, we have started looking at a number of countries. So we have most recent work cites some surveys from the UK, from Germany. We also work a lot with the Dutch data, which has very high frequency data where you can really get a detailed look at time use inside the family. The basic thing that we see is that the structure looks very similar across countries. So we see in all the places we've looked at that women are highly affected, with the one provision that it does matter what policies these countries have in terms of employment protection. So Germany is an example where there is this concept of Kurzarbeit, where essentially the government pays firms to keep workers officially on the payroll, but actually the government takes over most of the wages. So you don't really see, you see people working less, but they're still formally employed by their former employer. So the official unemployment doesn't go up as much. So in Germany, you see a lot lower unemployment in terms of levels. And also because of this protection, you see less of a difference between the women and the men. But the UK, for example, looks very similar to the US, at least as far as we can tell from the initial surveys coming out.
But let me follow up on this. Do you think this is simply a measure of law, legalistic? Because there is at least the expectation in the US or the UK that those people that have been put in a furlough, they will quickly, once the crisis is behind us, be re-employed by their former employees.
I think surveys show that many workers have that expectation that they will be picked up again. And it is certainly possible that this will happen faster, or at least at a higher frequency compared to a usual recession, because some businesses really are just shut down temporarily as you physically can't work. And so for sure, some workers will go back. But I think it's important to recognize, first of all, that the crisis might not be that short-lived, to some extent, because the medical crisis is not that short-lived. We are still far away from having a vaccine or like a real solution to this crisis. And in addition to the medical epidemic aspect, there's also this feature that a downturn can be self-reinforcing. You have people losing income now. That means they have to reduce their expenses, they have to reduce the demand for other goods, and that can reinforce this crisis beyond the initial shock. And so it's, I think the optimism that this will be a very fast recovery has been diminished in recent weeks a little bit. And so I think many economists now do expect this will drag out longer than we initially thought, to some extent because of the actual epidemic still going on, but in addition, because the demand declining really transmits the shock to other sectors that didn't really have the direct impact.
Yeah, so since you mentioned this, I know that the German government had also used a similar scheme back in 2007, 2009, which was some legislation, I think, put forward by Schroeder just before he left. But thinking more now about emerging markets, or even the countries of the European periphery, where they don't have such much fiscal space. Have you considered, for example, expanding your analysis more to countries like Turkey, like Mexico, like Brazil, not to say Indonesia or Africa more generally?
Yes, we have not done much yet, but we are certainly thinking about it and observing what is going on, because the situation really does vary quite a bit depending on what the state, for example, of a division of labor is within couples. So if you go to middle income countries, you mentioned Brazil and Turkey, you're kind of halfway to the point where the richest countries are today, in the sense that there is now a fairly high labor force participation of women. So these effects we see here, that you see women being unable to work because of the crisis, is also there, and it's likely to have the same unequal effects for women and men because of the reason of childcare, that the schools are shut down. At the same time, some of these countries, as you say, don't have the same fiscal space to be able to provide, say, income replacement during a prolonged shutdown. They may not also have the same ability to isolate. So if you not in middle-income countries, but if you go then further to developing countries, say in Africa, just the physical isolation is more difficult. If you live, for example, with an extended family, and it's just not that easy to put everybody in a separate space. And so these countries do face different trade-offs. And in rich countries, I think most people agree that economists also agree that addressing the pandemic as much as you can by shutting things down as long as you have to is the right approach. It is not completely obvious that if you go to developing countries, the answer is always going to be exactly the same, to some extent because shutdowns are going to be less effective given the lack of physical separation, and also because of the lack of insurance system making the economic shock harder to cushion in those places.
So let's think now more about the medium term. I know that economists and especially macroeconomists were notorious bad in forecasting, but a positive view would be, an optimistic, I guess, view would be, okay, fine, at some point, sooner or later, we'll be back at some trend. And then, this gender inequality gradually, the gap will go down. Do you share this view or?
So it's an interesting question, because we actually argue that there is forces that really work in two completely opposite directions, and we think they are both important, and I think they will ultimately play a role at a different time scale. Because even though we may be not that great at forecasting aggregates or predicting crisis, we do know a lot about the micro level implications of recessions. And it is very clear from existing work in macro and also labor economics that losing a job in a recession in particular can have a very persistent scaring effect on your labor market opportunities. Especially the longer the crisis lasts, if you lose your job now, you lose experience. You will often not be able to go back to the same kind of position, to the same step of the career ladder you were at before. And we saw after the financial crisis, for example, that the gender wage gap narrowed a little bit in the years after in the United States, which is very much consistent with the fact that the men lost more jobs. And so the men had a bigger impact on their labor market prospects than women, and that made the gap between men and women shrink. And for the same reason, now that we have a bigger crisis for women than men, in the medium term, if you think the next 2-3 years, almost inevitably, there will be many women who will have a persistent loss in their earnings even after the crisis is over, and that will put upward pressure on a larger gap between women and men. So that is some reason for pessimism, if you think about this prospect for gender equality in the labor market. But you can also go beyond this medium term and think about what are really the deeper causes of the gender gap. Why is it in the first place that we have like a 20% gap between women's and men's pay in the economy? And recent research has really pointed out that the biggest reason today, maybe not 40 years ago, but today, has to do with childcare. You see a very small gender gap for younger workers before they have families, before they have children. But once couples have children, you see that women's earnings start to stagnate, whereas fathers, their earnings keep going up. And that reflects that there's still a lot of inequality in childcare. So even among couples who both work full time, you see that in the majority of cases, the women do the largest share of work in the US, about 40% more than the men do. And they also are having a larger share of the flexibility that's required. So you have a sick child at home, who's going to take a day off to be home? Usually it's the mother. So it has to do with the flexibility of combining careers with family obligations. And so what we argue is in this crisis, we're actually likely to see changes that will ultimately benefit families and will ultimately benefit women more, because they are now having the majority of these responsibilities. And so one very good example is work flexibility. So now we have all transitioned to doing things from home. We've all transitioned to doing meetings on Zoom, not just in academia, but all kinds of employers. And inevitably, a lot of this will stay. These employers learn how to use these tools. They realize that by having people work from home, you can still keep things going, but you save the rent for the office. So it is almost inevitable that we're going to have more work flexibility across the board after this crisis because of the shock. And we can already see in the pre-crisis data, if you look at couples by whether you can work from home or not, you can see that couples who can work from home, who have more flexibility, already today have a more equitable distribution of childcare. So among couples who both can work from home and have some flexibility, it's a much more even distribution of who takes care of the kids compared to other couples. And so if this now expands to more of the economy, we will expect, and I think we will see, that some of these persistent gender gaps will actually decline as a result of the shock.
I sympathize with that, because now that we have moved to Zoom, my wife keeps reminding me that I have to do the homeschooling.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Do the reading. So my last question is, at the Wheeler Institute, actually, we like to think that business could be at least part of the solution. And many of our scholars work in low-income countries. For example, in Africa, business is considered to be part of the problem, or very rarely part of the solution. So do you see any role for business that they have to play positively, or perhaps preventing negatives in the months and quarters and years to come?
Yeah, so I mean, what we just talked about, I think is a very good example. Having more flexibility for combining work and family obligations is going to be very important. Allowing more work from home is a big part of that. And the more general issue is what you might call work culture. What are the expectations of different types of workers? One challenge you have is that in many career positions, if you become an executive, or if you become a professor, also there's still an expectation that you are supposed to be fully devoted to your work and almost pretend as if you didn't have children. It's still many businesses have this thing that just being in the office long hours, in the evening, and then going to drinks with colleagues is part of what's expected of you. It is a very pronounced, for example, in places like Japan, where it's almost universal if you work for a big corporation, but we have some of this still here in other countries. And that doesn't have to be this way. It's completely possible to do good work and contribute to your business while also sometimes leaving at 4 p.m. because you have to take care of your children in one way or the other. You can see, for example, in countries that today have more gender equality already, like Scandinavia, that there it's the norm is a bit different. That it's even for people in career positions, it is accepted to leave sometimes a bit earlier because you have other things to do. And so if we have a bit of a cultural shift, so that firms both offer more opportunities to work from home, more opportunities for being flexible in your time use, but also change a bit this culture, these expectations of the workers in the career track, that would actually be very helpful, because that is a big reason that leads to gender inequality today.
Yeah, I fully share your view. So, Matthias, thank you very much for taking the time and being with us. I have a last request. Since I find your work with Fabrizio Zilibotti so exciting, and I saw that you launched a blog about that I have studied among all of your papers, both yours and Fabrizio. This is the part I have studied the most, about what to do with the kids during the summertime. So I will kindly ask you or Fabrizio to join us again, I guess sometime mid-June, to talk also about this very interesting work of yours. Thanks a lot for being here.
Very exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.